What was the shock for you once you got introduced to a different type of culture that you was sheltered from and not put in that environment? How did that make you feel? But then more importantly, how did you look at your family in general? Were these topics that you brought up with your family? Because now you're coming out of Strongsville, you're going into the heart of what's really going on in America, in this country, period.
Yeah, it made me a lot more aware. So Cleveland schools desegregated right around that time. And I don't know if I would have even paid attention to it I had my first boyfriend who was one of Muhammad's sparring partners, who was a black man from Cincinnati. And, I'm seeing picketers on the street, protesters on the street, with vicious language, holding up signs with vicious language about, against desegregation. And all of a sudden that's personal to me because all of a sudden they're talking about my friends. They're talking about my boyfriend. They're talking about people I know and love. Prior to that, I don't know if it really, it's shameful to say because you shouldn't have to know people personally to
Mhm.
care or to recognize the evil of racism. But as a young girl in the 70s in such a segregated time and place, I was just clueless prior to that. And so I think what changed for me personally first was that I recognized it became personal. In terms of my family, there's a lot. My grandparents, gosh, I think about having Easter dinner at my grandparents' house and pulling out the pictures. I went on a trip to Australia and New Zealand with Muhammad, with his amateur boxing team, with a bunch of people. And I pulled out, not a bunch of people, but there were about 30 of us on that trip. So I guess it's a bunch. But we spent 2 weeks on that tour and it was an amazing time. And I came back and I was excited and I pulled out the photos and I showed my grandparents over Easter dinner. And my grandpa, I pointed out who my boyfriend was at the time. And I, pointed him out in a photo. And my grandpa said, well, that one sure looks like a purebred because he was dark skinned. I wanted to just put the pictures away and like, how can you look at him and that's what you think instead of saying how amazing that your teenage boyfriend is on Muhammad's amateur boxing team or sparring with Muhammad. Like what an amazing experience. How cool is that? Tell us about him. But it was no, that one must be a purebred. And I thought, like, what a terrible thing to say. My grandparents were very, very racist. So much so that, fast forward years later when I married my husband, none of them came to my wedding or anything. It was a sad, sad time to have that reaction.